So many marketeers these days, we keep hearing about podcasts. Why is it that people actually want to get into podcasts? And actually, if you do make a decision that you want to get into podcasts, how do you even navigate, how to get involved and the best way to spend your money? I just wanted to give you a few tips and a few thoughts in order to then help you make that decision. Hi, I'm Sal. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer for the Auddy Group, and I'm here to tell you a little bit about the different types of ways that you can get into podcast for you and your brand. Before I go into the differences between advertising within podcasts, sponsoring a podcast, or actually creating your own podcast, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about why podcasting has become, such a sort of go-to place for different people to actually spend their marketing budget. I think it goes without saying that actually when people are listening to podcasts, it's a much more immersive experience than if they're multi-screening and watching TV. They're listening to a podcast, they've actually made the decision to listen to that content at that time. And so therefore they're listening, they're engaged, they're actually hearing what is happening in the podcast. And so all of the research is showing, and it's kind of intuitive when you think about it, is that advertising is much, much more effective in a podcast than if you're listening on the radio or even a TV ad. Now, some of the reasons for that are that people hear your brand message. Now, sponsored reads, which is where the host of the podcast actually talks about your brand, is by far the most effective approach. When you think about podcast advertising, what that is just like in a radio ad, you have a 30-second ad spot, which actually comes in either before as a mid-roll or post-roll when someone's listening to a podcast. So if they're listening and they're really immersed into the content of whatever it is that they're listening to, then they're much more likely to then hear your ad. Now, generally speaking, I would always recommend podcast advertising as part of a bigger brand campaign. So you might have a campaign which is actually touching in, might be digital, might be out of home, might be radio, might be TV, but it's multi-channel. And so you've got lots and lots of different consumer touch points, and you need to make sure that podcasting is part of that, because that's where so many UK listeners are actually engaging with content these days. So the recent Edison research shows that 65% of audiences actually believe the ads that they hear in a podcast more than any other medium. So not only are they hearing your brand message, but they're believing what's being said, and they're more likely to act on it. It's a really, really strong medium for people. Now, within podcast advertising, you can start with a fairly small budget. By that I mean like a couple of £1,000s, all the way up to hundreds of thousands of pounds, depending on how big your target audience is and actually what objectives you're trying to reach. Podcast sponsorship is exactly that. You've chosen a podcast or a few podcasts that will help you to reach your target audience. So you might find that 18 to 34-year-old females are all listening to 3 or 4 different podcasts which are really sort of a similar topic to what you're looking for. If you sponsor those podcasts, you don't just get your brand message talked about to that audience, you get it done in a really, really authentic way. And the reason it's authentic is that it's not you or a voiceover for your brand talking about how wonderful you are. It's actually the host of that podcast talking about your product or your services and telling their own audience about why it's a really great product for them. Sponsoring a podcast can start from anywhere from, £1,000, to a fairly small, very, very bespoke audience, to it could be easily £50,000 or more if you're in looking at really the top podcasts. It's about identifying who your target audience is and which podcasts they're listening to, and then actually reaching out to that podcast to see if there's an opportunity there. I think one thing to remember is that you're sponsoring that podcast. It's effectively a partnership. So if that podcast doesn't believe that your brand is right for them and their brand image, they can say no. The third way that as a marketeer that you can actually get into podcasting is actually to create your own content. Now, this is the highest cost per entry, but it is hugely rewarding. Often why people might get into branded content, it's because they either want to build brand awareness, they actually want to start talking to an audience that isn't their natural audience. For example, they've got an older audience and they're trying to actually draw in a younger audience. But to do that, they have to have things that actually engage and excite that audience about their brand. Because just having an advertising billboard that just tells them about how wonderful they are they're just going to switch off and ignore it. But if you've got content that's really relevant and is talking to them about a topic that they really care about, then they're much more likely to engage with your brand and hopefully then to, go on to purchase and think favourably. The BBC research from a couple of years ago has really highlighted about how important it is. I think that's why so many brands are actually getting into podcasting now. I think last year there was 8,000 podcasts that were actually launched by brands. The BBC research showed that branded content can deliver an 89% increase in brand awareness, a 53% increase in brand consideration, a 24% increase in brand favourability, and a 14% increase in purchase intent. Now, it is absolutely incredible when you think about that, because branded content usually does not have a sales message. It doesn't really talk about your brand that much at all. It's literally that, it's content. So it might be two people who are talking about the rise of the fashion industry. Now, you might actually be a department store. But if you've got two people who are talking about the rise of the fashion industry and you've got two people who are really engaged with your target audience, they're going to want to listen to that. Now, your brand is definitely secondary, if not further away from that conversation. But by purely being associated with that podcast and by giving them content that they really, really want to listen to, it has a huge impact for your brand. The fact that it's 14% increase in purchase intent, I find extraordinary, because I would rarely recommend a branded podcast if you're trying to shift sales. And the reason I wouldn't do that, it's a long-term brand building exercise. It's actually creating content that your audience wants to listen to. It's making them think better about your brand. Them coming to then purchase your brand is just a massive bonus, because that's not what the original objective should be about. I wouldn't recommend branded content for pure sales objectives, even though it does do it a little bit. I would recommend that if you have a pure sales objective in mind, have a think about advertising or sponsorship. They're going to drive much faster short-term impacts for your brand. Branded content is a longer-term objective for you. At Auddy, we look after all three areas for brands. We can offer advertising in over 370 different podcasts within both the UK and German-speaking market. We also offer sponsorship, so we can actually help your brand to find podcasts which you can then sponsor, and we can connect you to those podcasters to make that a reality. And finally, Radio Wolfgang, our amazing team who create branded content, they will work with you to develop your audio strategy, guide you through the production process, help you come up with a fantastic idea, and then in the marketing team, we can then help you make it successful. We can actually build that marketing strategy, build that launch, and then actually really help guide you through the process in order to then have a fantastic podcast success story. If you found this really useful, I've got a more detailed blog about it as well. So have a look at it on the website, or sign up to our emails, and every time we've got a new bit of content, then we'll let you know about it, and you can be the first to hear about some great tips to enter the podcast space. In addition, if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. I think you can do it up here.